And if I'm going to say anything, there's only one person more incredible than the Incredible Hulk, and that's my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Now listen, Alex Pereira, I want a shama on your mama. And lastly, Michelle Obama is a man. Am I right, America?
And we begin with a clip from the June 14th, 2026 UFC event on the White House lawn, Donald Trump's 80th birthday party, in which mixed martial arts fighter Josh Hokit declares that Jesus Christ is greater than Hulk Hogan. Hard agree on that one. And Michelle Obama is a man. Hard disagree on that one. This is the No Donald, You Can't Have a Pony edition of the Political Junkie Substack. I'm Claire Potter.
And I am Neil Young.
And we're here today to talk about Donald Trump's birthday party. Our theme music this week is, of course, Kung Fu Fighting by Carl Douglas, copyrighted music that we have licensed from Lickty, so don't come after us, YouTube. Neil, there were Knicks fans all over Lower Manhattan today. Were they in East Hampton too?
Well, I don't know if we had a parade out here, but we did have a big viewing party the night of the night they won the championship, which I didn't go to, but I enjoyed watching videos of that on Instagram. Not quite as big as the ones in the city, but I have more to say about the Knicks at the end of the show. So
excellent. Well, I have to say, I think it's sort of a little hint from God that things are going in the right direction for New York City, that we have Zoran Mamdani as mayor, and exactly that year, the Knicks break their drought of championships. And they are actually the first New York team to win a championship in a really long time. So even though I'm not a Knicks fan, I was really happy about that. And I think it is a sign that things are getting better, don't you?
I didn't need extra proof that New York City is the greatest city in the world, but I certainly have loved this moment of seeing everyone in the streets. And like I said, I'm going to talk about this in my viral moment at the end.
All right, let's get to the news, Neil. Georgia had its primary on Tuesday. Healthcare executive Rick Jackson beat out Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, and incumbent Senator Democrat Jon Ossoff got the opponent he wants, extremist Mike Collins. Jon Ossoff also got a new name, Neil. I don't know whether I can ask you to say it on this
I'd rather
podcast.
not. I'd rather not. Though I kind of want you to say it, but maybe that's just something weird on my part. But yeah, this is awful. I mean, should we say it?
Okay, I'll say it. I can't make you say it. It is, now it's very difficult to pronounce.
Yeah, I don't
Donald
really
Trump.
know how to do it either, so that's partly it.
Yeah, it really only works visually, but I'm going to try. Donald Trump on Truth Social referred to Jon Ossoff as Jon Oss Jerk Off.
Yeah.
Which people are saying is obscene. It just seems kind of petty and adolescent to me, doesn't it?
I think it's all of the things. It's like, is this example 1 million or 1 billion? I can't keep count at this point of like how deranged and depraved this man is, and how much he's just diminished the office of the presidency with his just terrible character. But also, like, I do think it's something significant, like that this is what he goes for.
I think he has a lot of interns who come out of Young Republicans clubs all over the country, and they sit around and come up with these things. No, there isn't more to say about this, except that Jon Ossoff is being talked about quite seriously as a 2028 presidential candidate. I'm not altogether sure why he hasn't been that prominent in the Senate. On the other hand, Barack Obama wasn't either. I think Obama maybe, put his name on a couple of bills, but he was only in the Senate for maybe about 2 years when he ran for president. So I think Ossoff is being cast as a presidential candidate in the Obama mode. People think he's very good looking, so there's the kind of Kennedy-esque thing. Anyway, Ossoff had an easy ride to his own primary slot, and running against Mike Collins is going to be good for him because Mike Collins is far-right MAGA. And we've seen from some of the election results that Georgia, which is a purple state with lots of ruby red counties, is really not collectively going for MAGA candidates. The loss of Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones is being seen as an upset and a defeat for Trump since Trump endorsed him. What's your read on that, Neil?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is something where actually Trump has not been very good at picking gubernatorial candidates, which I think is interesting, and I'm not really sure if there's a larger analytical point to make there, but it does seem to be a trend that's where he's actually had a lot of weakness in his endorsements. Jones was a really extreme character. Rick Jackson is, a wealthy, multimillionaire, maybe even a billionaire healthcare executive who kind of, in a lot of ways, feels like how more Republicans used to be in the past, just really, really rich white guys who kind of just wanted to lower taxes and avoid all the culture war stuff. It'll be interesting to see how Jackson actually runs the race. Like, does he become a little more MAGA, a little more Trumpy? I don't think there's any indication in Georgia that that's the right political path.
I was thinking about Jackson. He spent $100 million on that race.
$162 million of his own money.
Of his own money. And so that gives us a new rule about money in politics, which is money in politics doesn't matter until it does. And I was thinking about Rick Jackson today because Alex Borres, who is running for Jerry Nadler's seat in Manhattan, but Borres was running ads in the New York Times. They were banner ads in the New York Times where you usually see private airplanes and wristwatches and stuff like that. So yes, money doesn't matter until it does. But also the other thing I was thinking is he was running against Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones. And I kind of wondered if Burt Jones had any kind of name recognition whatsoever. Like, I couldn't tell you who my lieutenant governor is. And I got an email from her just the other day. Lieutenant governors sort of sit around waiting for the governor to die, which they rarely do. There's only one high-profile case in which that has happened, which is Howard Dean, who was lieutenant governor of Vermont, and then the governor died, and he became governor, and then became a sort of path-breaking presidential candidate. So I do wonder whether Jackson's money gave him the kind of name recognition that Burt Jones was never going to have in the first place. I would also say, you're right, Jackson is claiming to embrace this sort of soft MAGA profile. And he says, I'm Trump, but I'm nice. And it did make me wonder whether MAGA is in the process of being institutionalized as something that can be separate from Trump. Actually a set of policies that are unconnected to Trump's personality. They've always been one and the same thing. But do you think actually they're kind of pulling apart and the Republican Party is looking for a way to take that MAGA brand forward into the future?
Yeah, I think we've been seeing that sort of unbraiding for a bit, or at least the distance between those two, the distancing between those two things. I think it's so tempting with the outsized character and personality and the sort of outsized political culture that's risen around this to just focus on that and to sometimes forget the policy agenda there. I think in part because, you have a person in the White House who's unable to speak of policy, and yet what a policy record that we've seen over the last year, frighteningly so. I don't know what a softer version of Trump is. Like, I think that's really not an effective political message for a candidate to make. And I don't see that having legs. But I don't think that that necessarily answers the question either of like what the future of the Republican Party is in terms of this bigger debate over what it will be, and you know, and sort of which version of MAGA or which sort of variation of it works that isn't
Right.
led by Trump himself. So yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think someone like Jackson is probably, but I mean, maybe it works in a place like Georgia where I think in order for a Republican candidate to win, you have to do two things: turn out the base in those deep red counties, make sure that they don't stay home, but also still do pretty good in the moderate Atlanta suburbs. And maybe he thinks presenting himself as soft Trump, you know, threads the needle of all that, but that's not a national strategy, is it? I don't know.
No, it isn't a national strategy, and it strikes me as very Georgia. And it made me think back to the late 19th, early 20th century as lynchings are raging through the South and the Ku Klux Klan is on the rise and Black people are being driven out of politics. And Atlanta declares itself the city too busy to hate.
Yeah.
And it's not that Atlantans weren't conservative. They were very conservative and they were very racially conservative, but they sought to avoid, except for one terrible moment, the Atlanta riots, which W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about so movingly in The Souls of Black Folk. They managed to sort of distance themselves from the violence of Jim Crow and to imagine themselves as good business people, and that being good business people meant not being extreme. And I think one sign that that kind of conservatism is still hanging on in Georgia, which is, as I said earlier, is a swing state now, there's no question about it, is that election denier Vernon Jones lost his bid to represent the GOP on the Secretary of State ballot line. And I think Republican voters in Georgia did not appreciate Trump putting them in the spotlight in 2020. And while they have not rewarded Brian Kemp with a nomination to be a senator, they did reelect him governor.
Yeah.
And Kemp really managed to play a kind of Mike DeWine role of saying, yes, I'm a good Republican, but no, I'm not going to go that far. And that strikes me as what Georgia is to me. So on the other side of the coin, Neil, I think the District of Columbia could be putting a Democratic Socialist mayor right in Donald Trump's backyard. Have you been following this race?
I hadn't until today, but I was texting one of my best friends who lives in DC and getting this scoop from him about it. But yeah, ballots are still being counted, but Democratic Janice Lewis George has a double-digit lead. I think I saw a last count. She has something like 50,000 votes. The second place candidate, who I'm now blanking on his name, has like 30,000. And this, of course, is in the Democratic primary, which will determine who is running for basically to replace, the last mayor, Muriel Bowser. Obviously, winning the Democratic primary in D.C. means you're going to win the whole thing in the fall. And Democrat, or rather, Janice George is a ward council member of D.C. And apparently has the voters behind her.
Yeah, she does. And two things. One is her opponent was a guy named Kenyon McDuffie, who was a Muriel Bowser type Democrat, a Senate. And I have a nice surprise for you, which is just about 20 minutes ago, they declared that Janice Lewis George was the winner.
Well, now it's official.
I know, it's official. And so she will, in fact, be the next mayor of the District of Columbia. I think this takes us back to a theme we've lit down on a couple of times, Neil, which is voters getting behind Democratic Socialists for local offices and getting behind mayors who are more progressive, when in fact maybe they wouldn't necessarily have done so 10 years ago. I mean, we know they wouldn't have done so 10 years ago because Muriel Bowser has been mayor. And Bowser has played a role of sort of trying to negotiate with the Trump administration, trying to negotiate with Republicans in Congress. She did not forcefully oppose putting National Guard troops on the street. She did not forcefully oppose some of the rollback of LGBT stuff. And it's hard to say whether voters held that against her or not, but clearly they want somebody who's going to stand up to Trump.
Yeah, I mean, again, I've known about this race for a couple of hours and certainly didn't follow it closely. But one of the things that my best friend that I was texting with, he told me he had voted for George, and the thing he said was that he appreciated her clear policy position against the occupation of D.C. And you can understand how that would be a defining issue for a DC voter, given what's gone on there for the last year. So at least for him, you know, her sort of clear position, he said, compared to the other serious candidates in the race, was how he made his determination.
Yeah, and you know, it's hard really to get anywhere in DC politics because there's nowhere to go in DC politics. You know, there's a DC council, there is the mayor's office, but and there is, I think, one congressperson, which has been Eleanor Holmes Norton for a million years. But that congressperson, I don't think, has a vote.
Right.
Just basically sits in Congress. There are no Senate races. So the question of how you get ahead as a politician in D.C. is an important one. And I think people have a tendency either to move somewhere else to be active politically or to actually go to work for the federal government. It'll be very interesting to see what George does. She's young. And of course, she is Black, which means that Trump is going to attack her viciously in all the gross ways that he normally attacks Black women. So let's keep an eye on this, and we may want to come back to her in a future episode. So, Neil, I've got some bad news here, which is that Republicans, who have told us nonstop that cuts to the social safety net are just about fraud and waste, well, actually, it turns out that's not true. You're going to be shocked to learn. ProPublica reports that as of this week, over 770,000 children have been cut from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise known as SNAP. Neil, tell us a little something about the SNAP program and why it helps children specifically.
Well, it dates back to the New Deal, to 1939, New Deal program. I think, you know, most folks might know as food stamps. And, you know, so much of, as you said, what it does is to make sure that vulnerable children have basic food and nutrition in this country. And I think that the real cruelty of this that's been reported is that a lot of the people dropping off the, you know, federal food assistant roles in recent, which it's been like 1.7 million people have dropped off the federal food assistant program because the paperwork has been made so much more burdensome. Right. And this is like a common tactic. So if you keep doing it, I can't even imagine how burdensome that paperwork must be at this point, because it always has been the case. But just to sort of overwhelm folks with the administrative task of filling out, you know, more and more forms as a way of dissuading people from doing so.
Right. And losing the forms. I mean, I heard one report on SNAP benefits in Arizona where they have so few people to actually process the forms, but the forms must be processed within 30 days of filing them. So even if you do everything you're supposed to do and send them into the office, there may not be someone there to actually put the paperwork through. I want to add a couple of things to your excellent summary here. One is that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a very, very smart guy, listeners, not only wanted to support the poor, he wanted to support farmers who were suffering from very, very low prices for the goods that they produced. And in fact, there's this moment during the Great Depression when farmers get together and start slaughtering cattle and dumping milk in dishes and so on because they can't get paid for it. And so it's this very, very dramatic moment. And so Roosevelt and his economists put their heads together and say, okay, if the federal government bought that food from farmers, it could then go to people who are poor and feed them. And over time, this program developed to not only supply money to the agricultural sector, but it also supports small grocery stores and large grocery stores. So people who are on SNAP, who would not ordinarily be able to buy food, can go to grocery stores and use their SNAP benefits to buy food. So there's actually sort of a reverberating consequence to kicking people off SNAP. The other thing I would say is this is something that the Welfare Rights Organization targeted in the 1970s. When they made a guy named George Wiley, who was the father of Maya Wiley, who's a progressive who ran for mayor in New York City some time ago. So George Wiley argued that being a welfare mother was a full-time job, that women spent so much time sitting around in welfare offices, filling out paperwork, calling up social workers, and so on and so forth, that they literally spent 5 or 6 hours a day doing this. So that if, in fact, being a welfare mother was a job, people should get what they were entitled to. So this whole question of making the paperwork so onerous that people drop out of the program, and it's happening actually across the social safety net, is really a time-honored conservative tactic. And then at the same time, you can have all these Republican congresspeople and senators saying, oh, no, we're just getting rid of waste and fraud.
Right.
We're not hurting any children. The final thing I would add to that is that the way poverty works is the condition of children follows the condition of their parents. If you are actually going to cut parents off of federal benefits, you are de facto hurting their children, even if they're not the primary target. Okay, so I think we should be following this story. And let me just say, I think ProPublica is great. They are a nonprofit newsroom, and they have done some of the best reporting on the Trump administration that's out there. So finally, Neil, our final news item is that in yet another attack on LGBTQ plus people timed for Pride Month, on June 12th, the Department of Veterans Affairs ordered VA hospitals to end gender identity-based initiatives and to dismantle networks and services designed to support LGBTQ plus veterans. What does this include, Neil?
Things like mental health, cognitive behavioral health programs that are specifically designed to help former service people deal with homophobia. Also, they've done things like removing the presence of LGBT plus service people from the website. We've talked on here a lot about just the erasure that this administration seems really committed to of all sorts of, marginalized persons, but particularly LGBTQ plus folks. I mean, I have to say, in some ways, I think it was a little bit surprising to know that the Department of Veteran Affairs, still a year and a half into this administration, still had gender identity-based initiatives that they hadn't already been, So on one hand, it's like, well, I guess we got a year and a half into this administration before they, went after this thing. But then it's like, oh, but they chose to do so in June of 2026 and Pride Month. Like, that's not coincidental, right? Like, there's such a deliberate, cruelty is the word we use over and over again with this administration. Such a cruelty is strategically used, and it's. I mean, is there any other way to say that? Am I wrong?
No, I don't think you're wrong. And I think the other thing that strikes me about all of this is this nation has been in a sustained conversation from the left and the right about the plight of white men, specifically white working class men. What's wrong with men? What are the initiatives we need to do to help men? And it just highlights that when we talk about men in a policy sense, I think both Democrats and Republicans, we're talking about straight white men. We're not talking about black men, but we're not talking about queer men. And I think the idea that straight men need particular kinds of outreach, of which today's news focus is going to speak to one of them, but somehow historically oppressed groups have no problems that cannot otherwise be solved in a straightforward way.
Yeah.
It's just intellectually and in a policy sense incoherent. And
ahistorical.
And ahistorical, right. And, we know, for example, that the military is a hotbed of homophobia and sexism. The idea that people need to be persuaded into these services that the VA offers is really sort of fundamental to what the VA does. I mean, I was listening to something on NPR the other day about homeless vets and how there are these special teams that go out on the streets to specifically find homeless vets and try and talk them into becoming housed and talk them into getting services. And one of the things that the interviewer said was that across the board, people who join the military are very proud. They don't want to be perceived as weak. They don't want to be perceived as dependent. And my guess is that is true of gay and lesbian veterans as well. And yet there's a twist. How do you persuade people who don't want to be dependent to trust you when everything that they've experienced from the institution has been bigoted?
Yeah.
So anyway, let's keep our eye on that story as well. And let's turn to our news focus, Neil. So on Sunday, Donald Trump celebrated his own birthday, and he said he was celebrating the nation's birthday, America 250, but it was really his own birthday, by launching a series of events that began with an Ultimate Fighting Championship mixed martial arts extravaganza on the White House lawn. Neil, I don't even know where to begin here, so can I throw the ball to you? First of all, what is the Ultimate Fighting Championship?
Well, it's the official organization that oversees this MMA league, so mixed martial arts league. It was created like in 1993, sometime in the early 90s. It actually didn't have a great sort of opening decade, was really sort of precarious as an organization, not a lot of fans for MMA at the time. A lot of states banned MMA. I think there was as many as 36 at one point. Who was John McCain famously called it human cockfighting, and I think he also sought to ban it. So out of that, really sort of inauspicious origin, it somehow scrapped its way. It MMA'd its way to a dominant position that actually now has had and become this sort of cultural juggernaut in more recent years, to the tune of being I think a $1 billion organization.
It's huge now. And I started, after I sent you the reading notes, I started digging into where exactly this came from. And apparently the origins of this thing are something called Pankration in 700 BC in Greece.
Well, let's start there.
Let's start there. But why is this important information? Because MAGA is actually completely besotted with the classical world, right? So that gives us one sort of link to why right-wing white men are into this thing. So it's the Pankration thing. But then apparently when this was founded in 1993, what they sought to do was bring together at least 3 distinct traditions, one of which was wrestling, one of which was something called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu,
Right.
and one of which was boxing.
Right.
And that the fighters would use all of their different skills. And some of them would have one skill set, some of them would have another. So it was fun to throw a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu person in the ring with a boxer and so on and so forth. But you're right, it was banned in most states. I mean, except for Nevada and New Jersey and maybe one or two other states until 2016, when guess who becomes president?
Wow.
So, yeah, right.
Color me
So
shocked.
Right, exactly. So apparently the rise of UFC as a real thing is about a decade long. But there's another little piece of history too, which is as the UFC is, as you were saying, not taking off at all, in 2001, Trump invites Dana White, who's the CEO of the organization, a longtime friend of his, to bring a championship to the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City. And that's where Trump gets identified with this. Okay, so Trump genuinely likes this sport, did you watch any of it at all?
Well, not on purpose, but like you can't avoid, seeing the clips on every time you like fire up Twitter or whatever. I also feel like it's a little bit like every time. This is like one of those things that like this will shock you, Claire, but like I'm not a huge MMA fan, and I don't have like a UFC viewing pass on my cable, network. But it's like one of those things that like I sort of now realize there's always commercials for it on,
Right. Right.
So yeah, it's like we're sort of, whether or not we're fans, we're absorbing it all the time, and it's been in hyperdrive this past week with the the videos from the White House lawn.
Right. Well, and it's actually quite horrifying.
It's awful.
We see the ads where they're sort of wailing on each other, but apparently the way you win the fight is you get somebody down and then you just like hit them in the face repeatedly until they pass out. And so by the time, and now there were 7 matches on Sunday. By the time the match is over, at least one person is unconscious. There are like blood and teeth and sweat all over the place, which is also kind of fascinating given MAGA's disdain for science, because in other sports, for example, in basketball, if somebody gets a cut, they stop the game, and the person has to leave the game until that cut is taken care of, because we know people can be infected by blood, right? And that started with Magic Johnson. When they decided Magic Johnson could play with AIDS, but they had to put in this new rule, and it had to be for everybody, which was really smart. Okay, so there's that side of it. But apparently there's another side of it, Neil, where there's a hold called the triangle, where if you get somebody down and you hold them between your massive thighs and you squeeze them in hopes that they will pass out. Well, apparently one guy got out of the triangle by tickling the other guy's feet.
That's what I would do.
That's what I would do too. I mean, it's incredible. So it's this big messy thing. They're in a chicken wire octagon cage. For the last month or so, the UFC was building something on the White House lawn, or on the ellipse, as it were, called The Claw, which was this like massive thing with multiple screens. The fights were preceded by motorcycle guys that were jumping all over the place. The place was full of military. There was a big sort of off-site place where people who didn't have a seat in the inner circle could watch it. Apparently, thousands of people attended, Neil.
Yes, and we could continue to describe this, because I think it's all really, it's just a rich text for us to interpret, right, Claire? Each fighter was like escorted out of the White House. I believe each of them started in the Oval Office.
Right.
And was and they were, and then escorted out by the National Guard or members of the military, and then nodded to the Declaration of Independence on the way there.
Right. It's shocking.
You don't need to be a PhD in anthropology or cultural theory to make a lot out of all this. But thousands attended, lots of people watched it, which they had to do on only one platform, right? Paramount, which we should talk about that, because I think there's a way that we can talk about it, and I think a lot of ink has been spilled about like what does it mean that the White House has been, brought down to the level of hosting UFC on its lawn, and I think there's a sort of cultural level of conversation that we can have here too, but like there's also real financial tie-ins, as there always is with the Trump family, and real evidence of grift and corruption. So which way do we go here?
Well, all right. Let's hold grift and corruption just for a second, because I want to ask you, and I really can't answer this question myself. Why do I feel that the nation is so befouled by this event? I mean, if it is in fact an entertainment that is adored by millions of people, gross as I think it is it inherently worse than other kinds of activities? Is there any reason why this, of all things, should not come to the White House?
Well, I think so many of its defenders are saying, listen, this is something that millions and millions of Americans love. And the Americans who love this are the average, salt of the earth folks that, right, the White House and government and elite institutions and media normally ignores. And so to have a problem, right, with this is to, thumb your nose, as you elites always do, towards the stuff that common folk like to do. And I think, okay, right, like that's not a surprising argument for them to make. Right. But then you could say, well, there's lots and lots of things that those people that love and right, show real engagement with, that maybe would have felt different than this. Right. Is there something about this particularly that's not about the fact of who loves it, but just what it is, that it is right, violence upon violence, that it doesn't win with a umpire declaring, this guy got 2 out of the 3 rounds and therefore is the winner, but is really ultimately with one person passing out with like blood gushing out of their face, that like just isn't the right thing for a White House lawn to feature. That you could have like a tow truck exhibition or a rodeo or all sorts of other things that might also be the sorts of thing that middle America, like whatever the adjectives you want to apply here are, but that don't befoul it, as you say. I mean, is that it? Is it the nature of this particular event that you have an objection to, or is it just the fact that it's sort of middle-brow or low-brow stuff? I imagine it's more the former, not the latter for you.
Well, yes. And then I would temper my sort of general cultural disgust with the whole thing with some things that we know. For example, we know that Muhammad Ali stopped speaking years ago because his technique for fighting was to allow people to punch him in the face over and over and over again. We know that somewhere around half of professional football players probably have CTE from concussions. And we know that people who do these sports do them because they're poor. And I say that knowing that people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk are very into the sport. Mark Zuckerberg apparently trains to be a cage fighter, although it's sort of hard to believe that he lets people hit him in the face over and over again. So we know that this is a sport that uses up people. And I say that as a person who, for example, used to love horse racing, and I can't watch it anymore because the horses are treated so badly and they die so frequently, and they don't have to. Racehorses don't die at this rate in Europe or England because they take precautions and they have rules. So there is something about the lack of, and it's not that there aren't rules in MMA, there are, but none of the rules are there to actually protect the people who participate in them in any real way. Like, you're not allowed to kick or punch somebody in the groin or in the back of the head. But actually punching somebody repeatedly in the face will cause them to become concussed. So there's that piece of it where I think it is putting out a vision of what it means to be a kind of MAGA superhero that no young man in the United States should be emulating under any circumstances. I don't care what class they are. So that's one piece of it. But the other piece of it that makes me less censorious is exactly what you're saying, Neil, that unless actually someone is willing to say no one should ever do this because it's uncivilized and wrong, to say, well, you know, how can millions of Americans take pleasure in something that is truly horrible? I do think that's an open question, and it's not something anybody really wants to talk about, this kind of normalization of violence.
Yeah, and I think the Michelle Goldberg piece we read that was in the New York Times, I think really got to the violence of this and the particular sort of masochism of it and the bloodiness of it and the sort of glorification of violence that this particular,
right.
I mean, it's wrong to call it a sport, right? Like, I don't even know, I guess, but, and the fact that this particular president loves it so much and that, like, this is what he wanted to feature, and wanted to sort of sit beside the ring, you know, cheering on in connection to the 250th anniversary, which, I mean, give me a break. This is all about his birthday. But like, I think, I think that's a piece that I would encourage people to read, because I think she does a really nice reading of what it means for a figure like Trump to be so besotted with this, you know, just orgiastic display of violence that this form has in this moment of decline that she ties to, you know, our negotiations with Iran. And I think there's something really smart and interesting there. And it does feel like, again, this is different than if they'd had a rodeo on the lawn or a monster pull. You know, I think those events would have brought out a lot of like tut-tutting from the, you know, elite intellectual class that doesn't like any of those things, but I don't think it would have exercised our energies in the way that like this particular thing does.
Yeah. You know, the more you mention it, the idea of having like the National Rodeo Championships on the ellipse just sounds unbelievably cool to me.
Like, do that. Like, have bunting everywhere, play country music, eat corn dogs, bells,
bells, you know, the whole thing. No, I think that's right. And in terms of the ancient world, this feels much more Caligula than, say, Athens to me. That it, as you're saying, in this moment of cultural decline, and let's, you know, you and I have not talked about the Iran war on this podcast by sort of silent agreement. It's been such an appalling spectacle all the way along, but I think we can say it, the United States lost that war.
Yeah.
Iran got everything they wanted. The United States got nothing it wanted. We are not even back to the place we were when Trump ripped up the Iran nuclear deal negotiated by the Obama administration. So that at that moment, when finally it looks like they might be bringing that war to a close, a very ugly close, that they then put this extravaganza on as if this is a sign of national strength. No, it's really not. It's a sign of national decline. Now, Neil, we read another piece by a mother who took her teenage sons to this event, and she ended up with sort of a different read on it. What was her argument for why she was glad she took her kids?
Yeah, I think folks should read this. It's also in the New York Times. It's by Hope Reeves. I didn't know her, but it's a wonderfully written piece. She's a liberal journalist, and she has 3 boys, 2 of whom, like, I think it's like a 15 and an 18-year-old of her 3 boys who are like really obsessed with UFC fighting and have like recently become like just totally enamored of it. So she took them to the fight, I think in a way to sort of partially engage them on some of the things that they're interested in, but also she says in the piece that she hoped that by seeing it in person, they would actually sort of be repulsed by it, which is not what happened. Like, she said her 18-year-old wasn't really willing to speak with her about any of his, thoughts about it, but her 15-year-old was like couldn't stop talking about it, and I think he said something along the lines of it being the greatest moment of his life. And so I think it didn't have the intended consequences that are the intended outcomes that she had hoped for. But, that piece gets at something sort of interesting about, she's talking about like, I've raised my boys in this like very feminist, very egalitarian, very, sort of honorable masculinity household. And like, how is it that this is the thing that they are so taken up with? And one of her sons says like, this helps me feel alive. And also there's such like a clear, like heroic character to these fighters that they feel really taken up with.
Yeah. So I thought that piece was a real path into another line of thinking about this, which is in a world in which everything seems inauthentic, cage fighting seems deeply and profoundly authentic. And I was thinking about, say, the comparison to one of its predecessor sports, which Trump is also involved in, which is worldwide wrestling. And the ways in which those were actually real athletes. Wrestlers were real athletes who then enter into this theatrical version of wrestling as a sport in which there are characters and storylines and grudges, and people do astonishing things in the ring, like, break chairs over each other's heads, but it's all fake and everybody knows it's fake. Like the chair is meant to break apart as it hits someone, or picking someone up and tossing them on the ground. They actually don't toss them very hard, and when the person hits the mat, they sort of slam it with their hand to make it sound like they've hit it hard.
Yeah.
And that on a certain level, one of the things we've experienced since Trump first came into office in 2016 is, as a culture, being told that nothing is real. The vote counts aren't real, the politicians aren't real, AI is making everything unreal, and that there is this kind of grasping for authentic, visceral, real life experiences, which a lot of Americans don't feel they have access to, and maybe kids most of all feel like they don't have access to. I don't know. Fight me, Neil.
No, I'm totally drawn to that argument, and I think that that's a really, really smart observation of this phenomenon, and I think that piece like gets into a bit, but I think you've really pulled out and sort of held up for us to observe much more closely. And I think, there has to be some allure for that, especially for young people who are only know this,
Right.
overridden digital world they live in, and where everything, is unclear when it comes to real and authentic and versus fake and machine produced. So okay, I guess like going and seeing men bash the blood out of each other allows one to know that there are real humans who exist in this world, and this is we're actually operating in a time-space moment, and all of this is happening in front of me. But like, I don't know, go on a hike,
right? Talk to grass people.
Go hear live opera, like go see someone do I don't know, Our Town. Like there's all sorts of ways that one can still know that they live in an authentic, real place that is unmediated by this hyper digital machine moment we live in. I don't know, but maybe something about violence feels really, really especially real to a certain young person in this country.
Well, and arguably it always has. I mean, football is a very violent sport. I mean, remember at the turn of the century, Theodore Roosevelt intervened when Congress was about to ban football because, people were being killed at the Harvard-Yale game, like on the field. People were dying. And Roosevelt, I think you yourself said this a couple of episodes ago, intervenes to save football so that his sons can play football at Harvard. And they put together new rules, and they force people to wear helmets and
create
so
the NCAA.
They create the NCAA. But it is also true that as sports like football, hockey is another very violent sport, remains a very violent sport, where even though the rules against fighting have become much more stringent, most games are interrupted once or twice by a fist fight on the ice, in which somebody bleeds copiously. The referees have to scrape it up with their skates and so on. But a lot of the consequences of that are hidden from the public. The fact that probably 70 or 80% of professional football players are hurt in some way. They are playing injured all season.
Yeah.
Is mostly hidden from the public. And it's only the sort of publicity around CTE, both in hockey and in football, that has allowed people to see at all that there are terrible consequences to this violence. But of course, that kind of story is not being told about UFC.
Yeah.
There's another piece of it too, Neil, before we get to the grift, which is each one of these guys thanked Jesus Christ, basically testified as Christians at the end of the fight. What do we make of this? What would Jesus have done at a UFC fight?
Well, and I just want to say that I don't know how much of the clip from who was it, Josh Hockett, you included in the
whole thing.
Oh, the whole thing. So when he's using the F word and he goes from a string of expletives to then talking about Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior, and it just feels. Is there a better 2026 sound clip than that? No. I think there's
and then says Michelle Obama is a man.
Yeah.
Which is the thing that made the news, right? I mean,
yes.
The two things together, Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, and Michelle Obama is a man. I don't even know what that means.
Well, he'll probably be the 2028 Republican nominee for president. But I think there's a way to, let's sort of maybe just take up this question about sort of espousing Jesus Christ before you go and, pulverize your opponent in front of, cheering fans. I mean, lots of historians have written a lot about the sort of historical phenomenon of muscular Christianity, which is like an early 20th century movement, which gives us in a lot of ways, the YMCA and all sorts of other sort of what we would consider mainstream organizations and sports in this country, but that had some components of it that really had sort of this violent or really this sort of particular melding of like hyper violence and a particular Christian theology brought together. And I think we have over the last 100+ years or so seen moments where that sort of flared up. And I think most historians, Claire, you probably know this history better than I do, but most historians say it's usually in these moments of like national fragility and real worries about sort of questions like around things like the health of the nation, and also about sort of the state of masculinity, where this muscular Christianity in its sort of most violent and outrageous forms sort of rears its head. So I think that's what I would suggest. What do you think, Claire, in terms of interpreting, these MMA guys talking about Jesus as they go into the ring?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I do think we are seeing a revival of what I would call a kind of retail Christianity. I don't know if that's something that religious history scholars talk about, but there is a retail Christianity in which you're selling particular activities and products, and I too am going to be talking about that a little bit at the end, through the idea of faith.
Yeah.
I would say the other thing that seems fairly obvious to me is that invoking transgender or non-gender binary people, or people who are gender binary and saying that they are transgender, that has become what the Pomo theorists would call a floating signifier for we are natural and authentic and they aren't. So it's a kind of us them moment, that when you say Michelle Obama is a man, you don't in fact really think Michelle Obama is a man. It's a way of bringing the whole crowd together and saying we are one, we are united against those people out there, women, black people, feminists, liberals, Democrats, whatever. So, but I think the retail Christianity thing is key. And at the kind of moment you're suggesting we're in, that national weakness is then followed by this sort of great awakening type moment. Of course, these people are finding a way to make money off of it. Of course they are.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about money. We promised we would get back to the grift, and we're getting back to the grift. This event cost $60 million to put on, which is said to have been absorbed by the sponsors and by the UFC. It's unclear whether this includes the $700,000 in security provided by the District of Columbia Police. But one of the things we've seen in the Trump administration is vast amounts of money pouring in to sponsor these events. And then, oddly, the same people get no bid contracts for this thing or that thing. So you spend $60 million, you get $120 million back.
Yeah.
So that's one layer of grift. Are you seeing other layers of grift here? You mentioned Paramount.
Right. I mean, I think that's really important here because it was only shown on Paramount. And of course, ultimately, I guess I'm not sure if I have the right parent company here, but like it's, related to CBS, David Ellison's, new CBS, there's all sorts of ways that we've talked about on here that CBS has accommodated itself to the Trump administration, and it seems pretty clear that there's a quid pro quo going on there, sort of an exchange of, they've been allowed to do things in terms of business. They've been allowed to make business decisions or different sort of what am I trying to say here? Acquisitions, financial things that because the Trump administration has allowed them to do so, and they've also adjusted their content accordingly. But I think that's only the tip of the iceberg, really, when it comes to all the stuff going on here. I mean, the Trump family has a cryptocurrency venture, which, like, it's crazy that we're even saying that, but what is it, Liberty Financial, like, they were the presenting partner of the Fight Night bonuses, and so that sort of tie-in, I think their signs were like all over the event as well. There's merchandise sales that were happening of like Trump and the UFC Freedom 250, like there were medallions and there were all sorts of merchandise sold at the event. There was a fundraising event. Trump held a $1 million per plate fundraiser for his super PAC. Corporate sponsorships that were going on, in addition to like just Trump has a financial stake in UFC's parent company.
Right.
And so, there was a massive corporate revenue that was obviously generated by this highly publicized event. So that's directly impacting his stock portfolio. Then there was that, I don't know if you saw this and it didn't get really reported out, or I don't know if it's been reported out, but I was seeing lots of sort of movement around this on Twitter of some sort of story about Eric Trump like DMing one of the organizers of the event and basically asking for inside information about the different fighters so that he could make bets on it. And so none of this is like surprising given what the Trump family always does, but like this wasn't just some like neutral event that like corporate sponsors made possible for Americans to view with like no tax dollars going to it. There were huge financial benefits for Trump and I suppose folks close to him.
Yeah, I mean, it's really staggering, and I'm sure what you're reporting out here is the tip of the iceberg. It seems to me that one of the functions of the Trump family is to have a select group of people who they allow to know things that will then make them money, or give them opportunities that will then make them money. But of course, most of the money always goes to the Trump family. I'd also like to point out that this has an overwhelmingly male audience, and men, of course, are the primary market for gambling. We have no idea what the gambling book was on this, but I'm sure it was in the billions. So there are other Trump allies who we can't even see who made money off of this. And weirdly, people like you and me, Neil, the gentlest people on the planet, are talking about mixed martial arts on our podcast. I mean, we have become part of the system because it's so ubiquitous that we can't not talk about it. Okay, I want to introduce two other topics just for our listening audience so that they can sound clever when they go out to dinner with people this weekend. One is that, for me, this sparked memory of other presidents staging other controversial events at the White House. And one I was thinking about was Donald Trump's favorite president, who is Andrew Jackson. In 1837, Andrew Jackson installed a 1,600-pound block of cheese in the entrance hall of the White House and invited the people to come to the White House and hack off pieces of cheese for themselves. Now, there are two things that are interesting about this. One is, when I dug into it, apparently the cheese came from Western Massachusetts. And how they got a 1,600-pound block of cheese, which was apparently like 12 feet tall and, at least as round. And so how they got that from Western Massachusetts to the White House in 1837, I don't know. But the other thing is, other than the fact that people just walked in and out of the White House, which is actually true until the Civil War, you could just come to the White House and walk in and say hello. But that because, of course, there was no refrigeration in 1837, apparently the cheese itself was gone in 2 hours, but the odor of the cheese and an oil stain in the front hall remained for at least a decade, and they were unable to get rid of it. So it's like the White House smelled of cheese for a decade. But the other thing Jackson did is, in either his first or second inauguration, I don't know which it was, it kind of turned into a riot because, again, they invited the people into the White House to celebrate. And then, much like January 6th, they refused to go. And so the Jackson administration had to quickly order up ice cream and whiskey punch and put it out on the lawn and say to everybody, time to go. There's ice cream and whiskey punch on the front lawn in order to get the people out of the house. It's just a good reminder that the people are not always so nice, shall we say. And we'll get to that in a second. But there are a couple of other crass things that have happened at the White House. One is that Warren Harding held smokers in the White House that featured not just illegal alcohol, but illegal fight films. Fight films were illegal in the 1920s because boxing was regulated. Many states didn't allow it. So you couldn't take fight films from state to state. In a different vein, something that was not crass, but also caused a terrible uproar, Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to dine with him at the White House, and there was an eruption of Southern senators and congressmen who were just outraged that a white president had sat down to dinner with a black man, even one as distinguished as Booker T. Washington. And apparently one of the things that was a very big deal is that Roosevelt's daughter Alice was there. So a white woman sat down with a black man. So there is this sort of history of conflagrations around the White House and also criticism of people like Abraham Lincoln, Jimmy Carter, and Bill Clinton as really sort of not being classy enough to inhabit this building. Is that a fair background to think about in relation to this event?
Well, I think all of it's like really wonderful, relevant context. I mean, we could also bring more history in here to sort of think about there's a broad and diverse sort of historical examples here. I mean, I would think, like, let's also talk about the Kennedys, and the way that they brought in opera singers and ballet and, cellist and Shakespeare readings. That, Jackie Kennedy had a stage constructed in the East Wing for these events that were supposed to sort of raise the, cultural profile of these sort of elite cultural forms, but also to democratize them. I think, in some ways the Obamas did this as well. But then there's also, like, your example of, like, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. It was like, well, Carter brought in, like, gospel singers, and, like, was that beneath the sort of dignity of the White House? And I think all of this maybe just speaks to the complicated meaning of the People's House in the American political imagination, and also in sort of the political commentary around it. And so I think maybe that's an ongoing feature of this story, but that, like, really changes over time depending on the particular context of the moment and who's making the sort of criticisms against which particular administration.
Yeah, and Neil, I think you have actually provided the key that unlocks what I really think about this, which is that the White House is sort of a stage for the whole nation. And what you put on that stage says something about what you want America to be. And I think what you said about Jackie Kennedy was really important. It so annoys me when people credit JFK with bringing all that culture into the White House. He was one of the most uncultured people on the planet. It was his wife, and she did a really good job of making that place a show place. Of course, Trump has, like, plowed under the Rose Garden that she designed, and so on and so forth. But it's the White House is a stage. And I think, to go back to the Theodore Roosevelt Booker T. Washington dinner, that is often portrayed by historians as like, well, Roosevelt just didn't know. He was from New York and he didn't know you weren't supposed to do that. No, I think Roosevelt did know you weren't supposed to do that. And he was trying to change the national conversation about race at an extremely volatile time, and it didn't work. But I think that's the key, that whatever the president does, whatever the president puts on stage at the White House, that says, this is what I want America to be.
Right. Yep.
Now, I just want to close by saying that there are also huge risks to having events like this at the White House. The FBI claims to have made 4 arrests of people allegedly conspiring to attack the event with explosive drones. Aren't Americans inventive? But apparently the investigation, which is ongoing, has the typical Keystone Cash affect to it, which is it was really a Secret Service investigation. They own it. They were trying to keep it out of the limelight because they have like 14 other people that they've arrested for disorderly conduct and drug possession, but apparently there are like 19 other people around the nation they're still investigating. And so the Secret Service is really, really pissed off. But the part I wanted to elevate is, you bring thousands and thousands and thousands of people to the White House and put the president right smack in the center on the outside. It's incredibly dangerous.
Well, and I know we should wrap this up, but I also just want to say, what have we been hearing for the last couple of months nonstop from this administration? That they have to construct this ballroom in order to keep this president safe. And that, this, I guess the ballroom, we haven't heard about it for a week or so. So maybe that's now, on the back burner of his, crumbling mind. But yeah, he's out there with literally thousands of people around him sitting on the lawn, wide open. And I've seen one, video clip after another of folks on the lawn just beating the crap out of each other. So who knows what all sort of drunkenness and other things were going on. Understandably at an event like this, but that would be, and again, not even from a sort of decorum argument, but from a safety and national security perspective, it's wild that they did all this.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. People were doing drugs, the whole 9 yards. Okay, Neil, what do you want to go viral this week?
Okay, I'm not going to pretend that I'm a lifelong Knicks fan. I'm not even going to pretend that followed the Knicks closely this season, but as of the last couple of weeks, I just got caught up in it in large part because it was great basketball. Also because I'm back in New York, the city I never wanted to leave, the city I lived in for nearly 20 years, greatest place in the world. And I have I've loved every minute of this march to the championship. So go Knicks, yay Knicks. And there's like so many great think pieces out there about like what does this moment mean, and like why was it so effervescent, and like what, and just like a joy explosion. And I guess that's the right word to use, particularly because of this piece I want to share in the New York Times by Matt Flegenheimer, and it's titled "Knicks Give Their City Something New: Impossible Joy." It's just a fun piece. I would love for people to read it. One thing that I think it points out that it's smart is, and I'll just read it because it's really well written. It says, it's sort of like, why does this feel different? Why does this particular, I mean, yes, it's because it's been 53 years since the Knicks have won, but it's more than that. It's different because I'm reading now, for all its mashed together brilliance, so little about this city is felt universally. It is rich and broke, and Mets and Yankees, and pitiless and big-hearted, and enormous and never smaller than it has seemed lately, when it thought that it might get to see something that so many Knicks fans believed they would never see before they died. And then I thought this point was really astute and sort of historically significant as well. He writes, "It is different because New York's mass unifying events tend to imply unbearable tragedy. 9/11, Sandy, COVID. But this wasn't. This is, and even you think about the sports teams, again, like he sort of makes that point, it's the Mets and the Yankees. There's sort of lots of divided loyalties around other sports teams in this city, but you got the Knicks and the Knicks alone. But that aside, and even this piece aside, I just wanted to speak about like the pure joy I felt in watching the clips of folks on the street, all those street parties of people watching, the streets packed with thousands and thousands of people watching on these, games that were being broadcast onto like the sides of buildings, and these huge TV, these huge sort of screens that were erected. I couldn't stop watching them. I think there's something, so it's not just about loving this particular city like I do, although a lot of it is about that. It's about just the shared experience of like folks celebrating something across all sorts of different, divisions and all sorts of different things that, normally separate us, but a sort of true united and universal experience, at least in this city, has been just the biggest balm to my heart, I think, in watching this week. And I kind of can't stop watching those videos online. I definitely lost a day to it, and probably more than just that. But I don't know. Go Knicks, read this piece, and if you want to have your heart lifted and you're not a total cynic, go online and watch people jumping up and down in the streets and hugging each other. I think that's really wonderful.
I think you're absolutely right, Neil. And I say this as a diehard Philadelphia fan who has only once in my life ever cheered for a New York team. And it was in 1986 when the Mets were playing the Boston Red Sox in the World Series. And I remember that moment when it's 2 outs, 9th inning, Mets are behind. Little blooper goes right through Bill Buckner's legs, and it broke the whole game open. But as the ball passed through Bill Buckner's legs, the entire city started screaming at the same time. And it is the kind of synchronicity that, I have to invoke someone like Benedict Anderson. You know, it's like an imagined community where all of a sudden class and race and gender and politics don't matter anymore. And it really is, as you're saying, it's the best of what sports can do for us. I'd also just like to say, these guys on the Knicks seem like really nice men.
I know. I really hope there's no skeletons in closets that like start coming out, because I just can't take that. But yeah, that is part of it too. They just feel like the goodest guys to cheer for.
Yeah, and somebody asked Jalen Brunson about the number of threes he hit, and they said, how do you do that so consistently? And apparently, he just said, "I work really hard at it." And it's just like,
I love it.
What better lesson to give America? So go Knicks. Hard agree, Neil. All right. So what I want everyone to read this week is Claire Hoffman's piece in Rolling Stone called "The Gospel of Erica Kirk: Leaning In with the Christian Women of TPUSA." Now, Neil, you and I have talked about Erica Kirk before. We will talk about Erica Kirk again. We have talked about Candace Owens' conspiracy theories about Erica Kirk. But why I like this piece is that it suggests that TPUSA is going from being an organization that organizes men to one that organizes women. I think it's undergoing a real sea change. And you and I talked about whether Erica Kirk could really pick up Charlie Kirk's mantle in the way that he had designed it. This sort of listening to young men, speaking to them from a male perspective about being a good husband, being a good father. We also know Charlie Kirk in his podcast was responsible for a lot of bigotry. His supporters don't really like to talk about it, but it's true. Erica Kirk actually doesn't seem to be that person. She doesn't seem to be on record needing to punch down on people in order to make her point. But what's interesting about the Hoffman piece is she's talking about a big convention in San Antonio that was only for TPUSA women. It's sort of girl bossy, very upper middle class, very much women who are both Christian and professionals, very well educated and very faith driven. And one of the things they all talk to Hoffman about is how difficult it is to actually put those things together in your real life. That if in fact you are a businesswoman, submitting to men is a very delicate question, because a lot of those men work for you. Submitting to your husband is not necessarily something that is very straightforward, and that there's a lot of talk about it, but that if in fact you are a professional, educated woman, to say that there are limits to what you can do as a human being because of your gender is not something that any of these women are very comfortable with. The other thing that Hoffman's article really pointed up for me is how much money there is in TPUSA. Right now, it is an $83 million organization, which in terms of a corporation is actually kind of modest. But it seems like Kirk is sort of poking around to see what is it that she can do to actually grow what she has inherited. And it seems, at least in the article, that it will not grow as a campus-based organization. We've heard a lot about how a lot of these campus chapters are splitting, and they're splitting away from the national and so on. But it also doesn't seem like it's going to grow toward organizing young men, but rather organizing women to organize the men in their home. And although Hoffman doesn't really talk about this, it really sort of harks back to the kind of Catherine Beecher national motherhood of the early 19th century, when women didn't have the vote, but they were thought to have a really important civic role as mothers for the nation. And it's how all those women's colleges get established, that a lot of middle-class people say, well, how can you have cultivated children unless their mothers are cultivated too, unless their mothers are allowed to be educated? So what it looks like is that TPUSA is trying to sort out what is the path forward as an organization, as Erica Kirk's organization in particular, but also that it's asking really tough and interesting questions about Christianity and gender.
I'm glad you talked about that piece. I've had it open and been meaning to read it. I don't know if you remember this, but Claire Hoffman is the author of a book that came out like last year called Sister Sinner. It's the biography of Amy Semple McPherson.
I had forgotten that. I love that book.
Wonderful book. I reviewed it for, I believe, The Revealer. So I think I talked about this on this podcast like sometime last summer when the book came out, and I wrote that piece. But it's a fantastic biography. She's really smart, interesting writer, and there's so many things that you said there that I would love to talk on about, but obviously we're going to keep a watch on, I think, Erica Kirk, and probably return to some stuff there. Yeah, I'm excited to read this piece.
Yeah, and I just want to give you a shout out, Neil. I was never half as interested in the history of American Christianity as I am now that I spend so much time with you. I actually actively move toward articles about Christianity. I have subscribed to Christianity Today, and I just want to say, listeners, this is one of the most important places where politics is happening today. And if you're not interested in Christianity, you are missing a big chunk of the American political story today, I think.
Over here doing the Lord's work, Claire.
You betcha. All right. So, Neil, on that note, I'll see you next time.
See you next week.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Kung Fu Fighting by Carl Douglas. Copyrighted music licensed from Lichty. That's all for now. See you next week.